Grant Locke waited until 112 workers were watching before he opened Mason Reed's locker. A metal box tumbled out and split against the workshop floor. Rusted identification plates, cut frame sections, serial tags, and water-damaged parts scattered beneath the car Mason had spent 11 months rebuilding. Grant lifted one corroded plate between two fingers. "This is what betrayal looks like." Phones rose around the workshop. Grant accused Mason of removing original parts, hiding identification marks, and threatening to delay the shop's largest project unless he received a share of the profits. Mason had never seen the sale price or met the buyer. He had received only his regular wages to make a ruined machine run again. But Grant was not merely firing him. He was accusing him of theft before the people who had trusted him for years. Because of him, every contract is under review. Overtime is frozen. Payroll may be next. The workers who once asked Mason for advice began looking at him as if he had stolen food from their families. Then Grant tore the silver badge from Mason's coat. It had belonged to Grant's father, the man who had taught Mason the trade. Grant dropped it into used engine oil. "Take off the coat. You don't represent this shop anymore." Mason obeyed and bent to retrieve the badge. Dozens of phones caught him on one knee, surrounded by the parts Grant claimed he had stolen. But Mason was staring at a corroded frame section near his hand. Two unusual drainage holes had been drilled through the metal. He recognized them. 6 years earlier, after a warehouse flood, Mason had drilled those exact holes himself. A fresh cut crossed the protective coating his crew had applied at the end of that restoration. The identification plate had been removed only after their work was finished. He had been told the vehicle went to a private museum and never returned. So, why was one of its parts hidden in his locker? And who had changed its identity after it left his hands? The previous morning, Mason still believed damaged cars told the truth. At 6:30, Air Tools snapped through Locke Heritage Restoration. Mason stood beneath Project Harbor, a flood-damaged car suspended on a lift. It had arrived 11 months earlier with salt water in the doors, a seized engine, and a weakened floor. Grant called it a confidential preservation commission. No customer, history, or destination, only a project code. That had become normal after Grant inherited the workshop from his father. Even before Edwin died 4 years earlier, Grant had controlled clients and transport while his father supervised the craft. Simon Crane, Grant's financial manager, approved purchases and rushed transfers from upstairs. Each team received only its assigned measurements, parts, or color codes. Mason inspected safety and workmanship at the end. No one saw the whole vehicle from arrival to departure. Grant called the separation discretion. Mason had called it trust. "Rear mount is still pulling left," Lena Ortiz said from beneath the lift. Lena, the structural repair supervisor, slid out and handed him the inspection light. "Measurements are clean. Metal can pass a measurement and still tell you something's wrong." Mason directed the beam across the rear crossmember. Then he saw the diagonal reinforcement. His hand stopped. Years earlier, Mason had designed that exact offset to stabilize a twisted chassis without cutting away an original mounting point. Edwin Locke had approved it but warned him never to repeat it as a shortcut. It had been a solution for one wound on one car. Project Alder. Mason had first seen the ridge at the flood warehouse, where Edwin took him to photograph a row of vehicles trapped beneath a rack that had fallen from the east wall. Project Alder took 14 months to restore. Edwin supervised the work. Grant handled the transfer and later said the car had gone to a private museum overseas. Mason had never seen it again. Until now. "Who installed this section?" he asked. Lena frowned. "It arrived with the shell. It wasn't in the intake photographs." "You're sure?" Mason remembered structural damage the way other people remembered faces. He was sure. Footsteps crossed the floor. Grant approached in a navy suit, coffee in one hand. "How far behind are we?" "We're not behind," Mason said. "Then why is it still in the air?" Mason pointed beneath the car. "Where did this body section come from?" "Inventory acquisition." "From which vehicle?" "Why does that matter?" "Because I restored it 6 years ago." Lena went still. Grant took a drink. "We reuse period material when appropriate. Not structural sections without a trace record." "We have records." "Then show me the source." Grant's eyes moved toward Lena. This is a confidential commission. I'm asking about the metal, not the customer. The documentation was cleared before it reached your floor. Mason looked up at Project Harbor. The car carried a different project code and a different body, but part of Project Alder was inside it. Harbor leaves tomorrow at 7, Grant said. The schedule says Thursday. The client advanced transport. Then transport needs to wait. Nearby tools began to quiet. Grant lowered his coffee. Excuse me? I need Alder's intake photographs and transfer record. You need to finish Harbor. I won't sign final inspection until I know why a car we sent overseas is back under another name. Grant stepped closer. You are paid to certify workmanship, not ownership. I'm not certifying either until I understand what I'm looking at. For a moment, Grant's face emptied. Then he smiled. Mason had finally asked the question Grant needed to punish him for. That afternoon, Mason searched the internal archive for Project Alder. The folder existed. The photographs did not. Every image after final assembly had been removed. Rachel Kim, the transport coordinator, found him at the terminal. You shouldn't be in that file, she whispered. Where did Alder go? Her eyes moved toward the office windows above the shop. The paperwork said a museum transfer. And the truck? Rachel hesitated. It went to a warehouse near the river. Another driver took it from there. Which museum? I was never given a name. Simon Crane had arrived before dawn and closed Grant's office door behind him. Rachel whispered that one of Simon's broker offices had been searched overnight. Before Mason could ask more, Grant's voice came over the speakers. All personnel report to final assembly at 8 tomorrow morning. Attendance is mandatory. Rachel looked at Mason. What did you do? Mason stared at the empty photograph folder. I asked where a car went. The next morning, the entire workforce gathered beneath Project Harbor. Grant stood beside Mason's locker. Security waited behind him. At his feet sat a metal box Mason had never seen before. When Grant opened the locker, Mason understood why Rachel had looked afraid. The box had not been hidden well. It had been placed to fall. The next minute became the image the phones preserved, the box breaking open, Grant calling Mason a thief, Edwin's badge sinking into black oil, and Mason on one knee among parts the workers believed he had stolen. But the phones missed the details that mattered. Fresh scrape marks crossed the box's corners. Gray cutting dust clung to its underside. Security had been positioned beside both exits before Grant called the meeting. Thomas Avery, who supervised the night shift, stood near them without looking at Mason. Grant had prepared more than an accusation. Mason lifted the corroded section bearing Project Alder's drainage holes. The cut is newer than our work, he said. This plate came off after the car left our floor. Grant pointed toward the floor. Put it back. You told us Alder went to a museum. I said put it back. Lena stepped beside Mason. Let him explain. Grant turned on her. Do you want your department included in this? My department worked on that car. Under his direction. The answer came too quickly. Mason looked across the assembly floor. Grant was not simply accusing him of stealing parts. He was placing every worker beneath him, turning years of shared labor into a chain of command. If I controlled these projects, Mason said, why was I never given a customer name? Grant gave a tired shake of his head, as though Mason were embarrassing them both. You were given trust. You used it to strip valuable components, mark them as your own, and demand money when the Harbor project was ready to leave. I never knew what Harbor was worth. You knew enough to stop the delivery. A few workers exchanged looks. Mason could see the accusation taking shape inside them. He had refused to sign. He had searched an archived project. Now parts had appeared in his locker. Grant had built the lie from actions Mason had actually taken. Mason held up the corroded section. Where did you get this? 3 blows struck the loading doors. The entire building seemed to flinch. The doors rose, revealing federal agents and financial crimes investigators. Vehicles blocked the yard outside. Teams moved through the workshop with practiced speed, sealing tool cabinets and directing workers away from the cars. Grant did not ask what was happening. He adjusted his cuffs. The lead investigator entered final assembly. Who is Mason Reed? Grant pointed. He is. Senior Craftsman and Final Authenticator. Mason had never heard the second title. Grant continued before anyone questioned it. No vehicle left this shop without his approval. The investigator studied the open locker and the metal around Mason's boots. Set the part down. Mason lowered it carefully, turning the cut side upward. An agent pulled his arms behind him. Lena moved forward. That box was planted. Grant's voice sharpened. Do not make this worse for yourself. What exactly are you accusing us of? Thomas asked. The investigator looked around the workshop. Money laundering, auction fraud, and conspiracy to falsify the identity and value of collectible vehicles. Auction. The word meant nothing inside Locke Heritage Restoration. The workers knew repair schedules, paint codes, machining tolerances, and delivery times. No one discussed bidders or sale prices. A young apprentice began crying when an agent took his phone. The upholstery supervisor kept asking whether she could call home. Investigators separated the engine team from the body crew and began reading names from a prepared list. Every name belonged to someone in the building. Mason looked at Grant. You knew they were coming. Grant's face remained calm. I knew someone had to answer for what you did. An investigator opened a tablet and showed Mason photographs of finished vehicles lined beneath auction lights. Different colors, different owners, different histories printed beneath them. Mason recognized the work. Lena's seam placement, Thomas's hammer marks, his own structural corrections. What were they sold for? Mason asked. That is what you are going to explain. I have never seen these rooms. Grant stepped closer to the investigator. He kept the workers compartmentalized. Most of them probably did not know the full operation. For one dangerous second, the statement sounded as if Grant were defending them. Then he added, Mason made sure of that. Workers turned toward Mason. Thomas's face tightened. You knew the cars came back. No, Mason said. I knew one came back this week. Grant exhaled through his nose, almost sadly. That is how he controlled people. He told each of them only enough to remain useful. The handcuffs closed around Mason's wrists. As agents led him past the oil tray, he saw Edwin's badge disappearing beneath the dark surface. Grant had planted the box to destroy his name. The raid revealed the larger purpose. By the time Mason understood the crime, the frightened workforce already had a reason to believe he had designed it. The first number Mason saw was $18,400. It appeared beside a photograph of Project Vale, a vehicle so badly damaged by floodwater that half the floor had been replaced. The second number was $12.7 million. Mason looked from one figure to the other. What am I looking at? Special Agent Mara Velez turned the tablet toward him. Purchase price and reported resale value. That car was not worth $12 million. Your mark is on it. My mark means the frame was safe when it left my bay. It is listed as an authenticated collector vehicle. I never authenticated its history. The interview room had no windows. Mason's work coat was gone. Oil still darkened one fingernail from reaching for Edwin's badge. Elena Ward, the defense lawyer appointed after the raid, sat beside him with an untouched legal pad in front of her. Velez opened another image. Project Cedar. Bought for less than $20,000. Sold for $9.4 million. Project Hollow. Purchased as salvage for $7,800. Sold for $6.1 million. Each photograph showed work Mason recognized. Lena's structural seams, Thomas's hammer marks, Rosa Delgado's leather pattern. None of them had known what happened after transport. Where were they sold? Private auctions and brokered transfers. I have never entered an auction house. Grant Locke says you stayed away from sales deliberately. Mason understood the trap. If he had attended, he would look involved. Because he had not, Grant called it concealment. Velez slid a sheet across the table. Below Mason's name were titles he had never used. Senior Authentication Director. Head of Historical Reconstruction. Technical Valuation Partner. I am a mechanic. You were the shop's highest paid technical employee. I earned $4 more an hour than Lena. You also received completion bonuses. She pointed to 3 deposits. The amounts were larger than Mason remembered. Grant had called them loyalty bonuses. Mason had used one to repair his garage roof and another to cover his mother's medical bills. What about the others? Mason asked. The full workforce appears across the restoration records. Appear as what? Potential participants. Velez placed a second page beside it. Names ran to the bottom and continued onto another sheet. Beside, several were notes that wage deposits had been reversed after the company's payroll account was frozen. Mason recognized every surname. Elena's phone lit with a message from Lena. Their wage deposits had been reversed after the company's payroll account was frozen, and several rent payments had already bounced. The words struck harder than the handcuffs. They did not know. That is what several of them say. It is the truth. Then explain why so many separate craftsman marks appear on vehicles with false identities. Because Grant divided the work. Velez waited. Each department saw only its assigned stage. Transport took the car after my safety check. Why accept that system? We were told it protected private clients. And you believed it? Mason thought about sealed trailers arriving after dark, cars disappearing before morning, and project codes returning years later. I chose to. Why? Because questions could stop the work. More than 100 families depended on that shop. So you ignored warning signs. I ignored things I could explain. That is not the same as helping commit a crime. No, but a jury may not give you that distinction for free. The door opened. Another agent handed Velez a folder. She read the first page. Within 72 hours, prosecutors will ask the court to continue detaining the supervisors and keep the company's payroll account frozen while they decide whether the restoration floor belongs in one conspiracy. On what basis? The craft marks, the divided workflow, and Grant's statement. Everyone? Unless legitimate restoration can be separated from the identity fraud. Mason looked again at the photographs. Different colors, different histories, different prices. Yet every job ended the same way. Final safety inspection, then transport. If the criminal changes happened afterward, the metal would show it. When can I see the seized cars? Mason asked. You are in custody. Then bring photographs of the hidden sections, frame rails, cut edges around the tags, anything beneath the finished surfaces. You expect to read intent from metal? No. I can read sequence. Mason pushed the tablet back. Grant wants you looking at names and prices. The metal can show whether our work ended before the identities changed. And if it does? Then the fraud started after the cars left our hands. Velez closed the folder. The detention and asset hearing is in 72 hours. Mason understood what Grant had stolen. Not just cars. Time. Get me 3 vehicles, he said. 3 that are supposed to have nothing in common. And if you are wrong? Mason looked at the names spread across the table. Then do not charge 112 people because they trusted me. Mason did not see the seized cars that afternoon. Velez interviewed the workers separately, each with counsel present. Mason was kept in a different part of the building, where Elena later brought him 7 signed summaries and a diagram of the shop floor. You can analyze the process, she told him. You cannot shape anyone's memory. The first summary belonged to Lena. Structural repair received a stripped body shell, damage measurements, and a work order. No ownership documents. No sale estimate. No destination. The engine team received numbered crates. Paint received a color formula and a deadline. Rosa Delgado's upholstery crew sometimes finished an interior without seeing the exterior color. One sentence from Rosa's recorded statement had been underlined. We joked that we were building cars in the dark. Mason arranged the summaries by stage. Strip, repair, seal, paint, assemble, test. His safety inspection came after every department signed off. Transport assumed control afterward. No single worker saw the whole vehicle from arrival to destination. The system did not merely protect client privacy. It prevented recognition. Elena opened the 6th summary. Thomas Avery had first denied that anyone worked after the regular crews left. 2 hours later, through his own lawyer, he asked to supplement his statement. Velez had allowed Elena to show Mason the recorded excerpt after Thomas's counsel approved it. On the screen, Thomas rubbed one thumb across his index finger before speaking. 4 or 5 men came in after final inspection, he said. Not on every project. Grant ordered him to leave the West Bay unlocked and send the night shift home. Once, Thomas returned for medication and found portable lamps around a rear frame. One man carried a cutting wheel. Another carried metal stamps. Thomas had not reported it. Grant had told him collectors would pull every contract if anyone discussed private registry corrections. Thomas supervised 38 people and believed one complaint could close the shop. His silence did not prove participation. It proved Grant knew which fear to use. The most important line came at the end of Thomas's statement. The outside crew never entered before Mason completed the final inspection. That was the boundary. The seventh summary belonged to Rachel Kim. She scheduled transport from the shop to a warehouse near the river. Every shop driver stopped there. A second dispatcher then took control, and Rachel lost access to the vehicle record. She had never been given the second dispatcher's name, only a recurring transfer prefix Mason recognized from Grant's rush orders. Velez entered the attorney room at 6:14 p.m. and placed her phone on the table. 14 vehicles are being prepared for movement under that prefix. When? Mason asked. 11:30 tonight. There are 3 possible sites, Elena said. Mason pulled a legal pad toward him and drew a frame rail, a rocker cavity, and a rear crossmember. Do not begin with badges or visible plates. Those can be changed. Put a scope into the lowest sealed cavities. Flood sediment remains where pressure washing cannot reach. He marked 2 drainage points. If the cars came from the warehouse flood batch, the sealed cavities would still hold the same sediment. Project Alder would also have these drainage holes and the rear frame correction. We used that reinforcement pattern on Alder and nowhere else. Can that identify them without a full teardown? Velez asked. Enough to stop them from leaving. Mason looked at the signed statements spread across the table. Keep the workers' names restricted. If the network learns who can identify the cars, the people on that list become targets before they become witnesses. Velez ordered the names sealed and sent search teams toward the river. Mason was no longer asking investigators to believe him. He had given them something they could test before midnight. At 8:47 p.m., Agent Velez returned with photographs from the first warehouse, not the cars themselves, not yet. The search team had entered a riverfront storage building and found 5 vehicles under gray covers. Their visible identification plates matched the paperwork on site. Their bodies looked clean, polished, and ready for transport. But one agent had followed Mason's instructions and pushed a camera into the lowest cavity of a rear frame. The first image showed pale sediment packed behind a reinforcement plate. The second showed 2 drainage holes. The third showed a diagonal brace Mason had designed 6 years earlier. Velez placed the photographs across the table. Project Alder, Mason said. You are certain? I made that brace. She added another set from a blue coupe found 2 bays away. The exterior was different. The wheelbase had been altered. The interior photographs showed cream leather and polished wood. Mason ignored all of it. He studied the inner frame. The same tide line crossed the metal at the same height. The same mineral deposit sat inside the rocker cavity. One side of the rear rail bent upward by less than half an inch. That was beside Alder in the flood warehouse, he said. How can you know that? The rack collapsed from the east wall. The cars beside Alder took the same upward twist. This damage matches the photographs. Velez watched him for a moment, then placed down a third file. A black roadster recovered months earlier from a private collection in another state. Its advertised history claimed it had spent 40 years in a dry family garage. Mason found the same sediment beneath the rear crossmember. 3 cars, 3 owners, 3 stories, 1 flood. Velez called the search team and asked for live video. A technician at the warehouse moved a scope beneath the black roadster. Mason directed him toward a sealed pocket behind the suspension mount. Scrape the inner edge, not the painted surface. The technician exposed a thin brown line. Salt corrosion. Older than the paint. Older than the false identity attached to the car. Velez muted the call. What does this prove? That these cars were restored from the same damaged batch. It does not prove laundering. No, but it proves their public histories are false. And the workers? Mason arranged the photographs in the order the repairs had been performed. The drainage holes came first. then the structural braces, then anti-corrosion coating, then paint. He pointed to a cut around an identification mount. This cut crosses the coating. It happened later. On the second vehicle, the edge of a new plate had been welded over finished paint. On the third, grinding marks had sliced through sealant Mason's team used only after safety approval. The pattern was the same. The workers repaired anonymous wrecks. Someone else gave them identities afterward. Velez unmuted the call. Check every vehicle for cuts above final coating. Photograph the layers before moving anything. A second voice entered the line. Agent, we have movement at the south loading bay. A camera turned toward 3 enclosed trailers. Men were closing the rear doors while another vehicle waited near the gate. The warehouse clock read 9:16. They are leaving early, Rachel said from across the room. Velez looked at her. The departure time was 11:30. Then they know the first site is compromised. Velez began issuing orders. Mason studied the live image. One trailer carried no company name, but its rear suspension sat lower on the right. That trailer is loaded unevenly. How many cars? Velez asked. More than one. I cannot tell how many from this angle. Agents moved toward the loading bay. The video shook. A man ran between 2 trailers. Another vehicle struck a stack of empty pallets while trying to turn. Metal crashed across the concrete. Then the feed froze. For 6 seconds, no one spoke. The image returned with agents surrounding the first trailer. A second team pulled the driver from the cab. The third trailer had made it through the gate. Track it, Velez ordered. Aerial units were already moving. Mason should have felt relief. Instead, he was looking at a photograph from the recovered blue coupe. A hammer mark sat behind the left wheel arch. 3 shallow strikes, 1 deep. Thomas's pattern. Beside it was a narrow weld shaped like a falling line. Lena's. Those marks were not signatures of fraud. They were the history of repair. Yet Grant had turned them into names on an indictment. Mason picked up the third photograph. A second set of cuts appeared behind the false identification mount. Cleaner, narrower, made with a high-speed wheel unavailable on the main floor. Can your technicians compare this cutting residue to the dust on the box from my locker? Velez looked at him. The box had gray dust underneath, Mason said. If it came from this warehouse, the particles may match. That would connect the planted evidence to the identity removal site. It would connect Grant to the part of the process none of us were allowed to see. Rachel stepped closer to the monitor. There is another warehouse. Velez turned. Rachel pointed to a transfer code on the screen. That prefix does not belong to the river sites. It belongs to a private airfield outside Belhaven. How many vehicles? I do not know. Mason studied the code. Project Harbor's rush transport order carried the same prefix. The car Grant had framed him beneath had never been scheduled for a museum. It was being prepared to leave by air. Velez checked the time. 9:28 p.m. The last trailer was still moving. The airfield was 40 minutes away, and somewhere between them sat the car containing the first piece of metal that had warned Mason the dead were being given new names. Aerial tracking followed the escaped trailer to the private airfield. At 10:11 p.m., agents stopped it at the north gate and arrested 4 men beside a portable stamping press. Inside the hangar, Project Harbor already had its transport wheels fitted. Grant Locke was not among them. He was sitting in a federal conference room with 2 attorneys. Mason learned that from Velez when she returned to the interview room. They recovered Harbor, she said. 9 vehicles at the airfield, 14 at the river sites. Several buyers are being detained. Mason waited for relief. It did not come. Velez placed a laptop on the table. Grant's counsel submitted a cooperation statement. The screen showed Mason beside Project Hollow after final inspection. Beneath the photograph, a caption named him Chief Historical Authenticator. I never approved that title. There are 43 promotional files using it. The next image showed Mason receiving a completion envelope from Grant. Another showed him shaking hands with a broker he remembered only as a visitor. Then came the workshop video. Mason on one knee. Identification plates around him. His hand closing over the oil-covered badge. Grant's statement appeared beside it. Mason Reed became hostile after learning the true value of the Harbor project. He controlled restoration methods, restricted employee access, and retained original identifiers for leverage. He is saying I blackmailed him. He says you threatened to expose defects unless you were paid. I asked where the frame came from. Velez opened a banking summary. Completion bonuses had arrived within days of several high-value sales. Grant had timed them carefully. None had seemed extraordinary alone. Arranged beside auction dates Mason had never seen, they looked like percentages. He built this before the raid, Mason said, maybe years before. The door opened, and Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Price entered. Mr. Reed, Grant Locke is offering testimony about the technical structure of the operation. He does not know the technical structure. He knows who did. Price sat opposite him. His position is simple. He handled clients and cash flow. You controlled the method that turned salvage vehicles into convincing collector cars. We restored damaged cars. You developed repeatable techniques used across the inventory. To make them safe, techniques that made false histories believable. The accusation settled exactly where Grant wanted it. The better Mason had been at his job, the more useful he looked to the crime. Price continued. Mr. Locke claims the workers were compartmentalized under your direction. That was his system. Then why were you the only person who could recognize cars across departments? Because I inspected final work. Which gave you the complete picture. Only before transport, not after. Price replayed the workshop video. Grant's voice filled the room. Because of him, every contract is under review. Overtime is frozen. Payroll may be next. Workers surrounded Mason. No one defended him. The entire shop trusted you, Price said. Grant says you used that trust to keep them compliant. Grant's story sounded plausible because Mason had noticed sealed trailers, returning structures, and missing photographs and had chosen explanations that let the work continue. Price watched him. Responsibility can look like knowledge. Responsibility is not conspiracy, Mason said. Velez received a message and handed her phone to Price. His expression shifted. The cutting residue from the parts in your locker matches residue collected from the identity removal bay, she said. That box came from their warehouse. It supports that possibility. Grant carried evidence from the secret operation into my locker. Grant's statement had been designed to arrive before the physical comparison. Now the stories had collided. Velez opened an image from Project Harbor. The later identity cut crossed the crew's finished work. Price enlarged the edge. If this is consistent across the seized vehicles, Grant's version has a problem. He knows that. That is why he needs the court to accept his deal before you finish looking. Price checked the time. The detention and asset hearing is scheduled for 10 tomorrow morning. Grant wants his cooperation proffer accepted there. If the court credits his version, Price said, you stay detained, the company's payroll account remains frozen, and the craft marks become the foundation for a broader conspiracy case. Mason pictured Lena, Rosa, Thomas, and the apprentices waiting without access to their pay. Then tomorrow is not only about his deal. No. It decides whether the government can keep treating our work as his criminal organization. Mason looked at the paused video of himself on the floor. Grant had made the humiliation public because he needed a picture stronger than the truth. Put the box in front of him tomorrow, Mason said. Price raised an eyebrow. Let him explain how parts from a locked criminal site reached my locker before federal agents arrived. And if he says you moved them, then open harbor beside it. Mason pointed to the cut line. Metal does not care which one of us has the better lawyer. At 6:42 the next morning, Rachel Kim asked through her attorney to amend her statement. Velez interviewed her without Mason present. Elena received the signed supplement 20 minutes later and read the relevant passages to him in the attorney conference room. Rachel admitted Grant kept a second dispatch list outside the company system. She had seen it twice while preparing overnight transfers. Her initials appeared on the shop's first stage deliveries. After the river warehouse, Simon Crane's drivers took control. Rachel had told herself her responsibility ended when the shop driver returned. Then she disclosed why Grant had been ready for the raid. At 5:11 the previous afternoon, Simon had called her from the road and demanded to speak with Grant immediately. Rachel heard only one complete sentence before the office door closed. The broker talked. Warrants are moving. 7 minutes later, at 5:18 p.m., Grant ordered the mandatory meeting for 8 the next morning and told security to cover both exits. Grant had not known every detail of the raid. He had known enough time remained to choose a scapegoat. Rachel's list showed C9 transfers to the airfield and R4 transfers to the river sites. Other vehicles were collected by outside drivers whose names she was forbidden to record. Thomas also submitted a supplemental statement through counsel. He remembered Simon telling Grant that no vehicle could move until the ledger was empty. Thomas had assumed the phrase meant the repair file was closed. After seeing the removed plates and false mounting points, he understood it meant every trace of the vehicle's earlier identity had been stripped away. Thomas described the night crew more fully. They arrived without employee badges and carried portable stamps, cutting wheels, and small torches. Grant kept the West Bay locked until they left. No restoration supervisor met them. Mason never worked beside them. Thomas admitted why he had remained silent. Grant showed him a contract list and said one complaint would close the shop by Friday. At 7:18, Velez received the first full report from the airfield search. Metal fragments on the portable stamping press matched cuts found on 6 seized vehicles. A storage room contained removed identification plates, ownership emblems, and original frame sections. 3 men had been preparing false mounting points on Project Harbor. One worked for Simon Crane. Another had bid on 2 restored cars through a shell company. The third carried photographs taken inside Lock Heritage Restoration after regular employees had gone home. The investigation was no longer limited to the restoration shop. Search teams moved on 2 broker offices, a private auction facility, and 4 addresses linked to buyers who repeatedly traded the same vehicles through different companies. Simon Crane was missing. Rachel's supplement identified a regional field north of Belhaven where she had once arranged a private driver for him. At 7:41, Grant's attorneys asked the court to credit his cooperation proffer before the remaining forensic tests were complete. They need his story accepted before Crane is found, Mason said. And before Rachel and Thomas testify, Elena replied. Both witnesses had already agreed, through counsel, to appear. Elena met them briefly in the courthouse corridor after their statements were sealed. Do not say you saw nothing, she told them. Say what you saw, why you looked away, and where your knowledge ended. Thomas glanced toward Mason. And you? I will do the same, Mason said. At 8:03, agents stopped Simon Crane's car outside the northern airfield. In the trunk were passports, cash, and keys to storage units linked to the shell buyers. The arrests protected no one yet. The hearing still began at 10, but the structure of the crime had changed. It no longer looked like one mechanic commanding a hidden workforce. It looked like 2 operations sharing a wall, one filled with people repairing damaged machines, and another filled with men who waited until those people went home before giving the machines new names. The detention and asset hearing began at 10:02 a.m. Grant Locke entered through the side door in a charcoal suit, followed by 2 attorneys and a federal marshal. He was not wearing handcuffs. The hearing had a limited purpose: decide whether Mason should remain detained, whether the company's frozen payroll account should remain restrained, and whether the government could rely on Grant's cooperation proffer while it built the larger case. Workers from Lock Heritage Restoration filled 3 rows. Lena sat beside Rosa. Thomas and Rachel waited with separate counsel after disclosing their supplemental statements that morning. Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Price addressed Judge Albright. The government initially relied on Mr. Locke's account to describe the technical structure of the operation. New physical evidence requires that account to be tested before the court gives it further weight. Grant's attorney called him to the witness chair. Grant described himself as a businessman who had inherited a dying craft and trusted the only mechanic capable of controlling its technical processes. Mason selected the methods, he said. He approved structural changes, divided the departments, and marked every completed car. Why would he do that? His attorney asked. Grant looked toward the workers. Because he wanted control. I found clients and kept the doors open. Those people had paychecks because I turned ruined machines into assets buyers wanted. Mason decided he deserved more than wages. The statement was not an apology. It was Grant's private logic spoken aloud. If the shop survived, Every lie used to preserve it became necessary. Then the photograph appeared. Mason on one knee. Cut plates and corroded metal around him. That was when we discovered he had retained original identifiers, Grant said. He tried to recover them after being confronted. Because Grant's statement was being used to justify Mason's detention and the continued restraint of the workers' accounts, Elena was permitted to cross-examine him. 2 technicians placed the damaged metal box on a cart. Every piece inside carried an evidence number. Elena lifted the first plate with gloved hands. Did you see Mason remove this? No. Did anyone report seeing him remove it? He controlled the floor. That was not my question. No. A technician enlarged the plate's edge beside an intake photograph of Project Alder. This was removed after the shop's restoration work ended. Elena said. Where was the vehicle then? I cannot say. Yet the part appeared in Mason's locker minutes before federal agents arrived. Price confirmed that no evidence placed Mason at the river warehouse or airfield where matching cutting residue had been collected. Elena selected 2 more pieces. Both had been removed after the restoration finish had cured. Residue trapped beneath the box matched material beside the portable stamping press. How did objects from a restricted identity removal site reach Mason's locker before the raid? He must have moved them. Then the court should look at Project Harbor. A live feed appeared from the evidence facility. Project Harbor stood beneath white lights with its rear frame exposed. Elena called Mason for the limited purpose of explaining visible restoration sequence. Grant's attorney objected because Mason remained under investigation. Judge Albright looked at Price. Does the government dispute his mechanical competence? No, Your Honor. Mr. Locke's own proffer depends on it. Mason took the oath. He identified Lena's reinforcement seam, Thomas's shaping marks, and his own safety stamp. All belonged to the completed restoration. The later identity cut crossed that finished work and matched the tool pattern found at the airfield. Judge Albright asked whether a worker performing the earlier repair could know what identity would later be attached to the vehicle. No, Mason said. Not from the work we were given. Could you? Mason looked toward the workers. I saw more of the finished car than most. I also ignored questions I should have asked. But I never saw the new identities, buyers, or sale prices. Grant's attorney stood. Sequence does not prove my client ordered anything. No, Mason said. The box shows who had access to the later operation. The technician displayed the split corner. Gray cutting dust remained trapped beneath folded metal, mixed with flakes of bright blue finish. Project Harbor was dark green. Elena displayed the blue coupe seized at the river warehouse. A section beside its false identity mount had been cut away. The finish matched the flakes inside the box. The box had been present while parts from multiple vehicles were removed. Someone then carried it from the hidden worksite to Mason's locker. On one screen, the photograph still showed Mason kneeling among the parts. On the other, the box showed where those parts had truly been collected. Grant turned toward Price. Simon Crane managed those sites. Price answered. Mr. Crane was arrested with keys to the storage units and transfer instructions bearing your authorization code. Grant's composure broke. I kept that shop alive, he said. Every person behind me took the wages. They praised the contracts. Now they want to pretend the money became dirty only after it reached my office. Thomas Avery was called next. His supplemental statement had already been provided to every attorney. He confirmed Grant cleared the floor after Mason's inspections, ordered the West Bay unlocked, and threatened to close the shop if Thomas questioned the night crew. Thomas did not excuse himself. I saw enough to ask, he said. I chose payroll over the question. Rachel identified Grant's approval codes on the airfield transfers and confirmed Mason never received the second-stage destinations. She also described Simon's warning before the raid and Grant's immediate order to gather the workforce. Grant leaned toward them. You were happy to stay quiet when the checks cleared. Thomas faced him. Yes. That is the part of the truth you cannot use for us anymore. Price stood. The government withdraws its recommendation that the court credit Mr. Locke's cooperation proffer. Judge Albright found Grant's account unreliable and the planted box sufficient to establish probable cause for obstruction and evidence fabrication. She ordered Grant detained, pending the wider conspiracy case. She also ruled that craft marks alone could not justify Mason's continued detention or the ongoing restraint of the company's payroll account. Mason was released under conditions, and the payroll account was ordered unfrozen while individual roles remained under review. No one had been declared innocent by a single hearing. But Grant's story could no longer serve as the shortcut that made everyone guilty. Marshals approached the witness chair. Grant Locke left through the door Mason had entered. This time, he was wearing the handcuffs. The workers were not cleared in a single afternoon. For 12 more days, investigators reviewed shifts, tool assignments, transport logs, and every craft mark found on the seized vehicles. Each worker had to explain what he or she had touched when the work ended and who took control afterward. Elena updated Mason after each session, and he helped build a technical timeline from the signed summaries. He never asked anyone to claim they had seen nothing. The timeline had to be precise, not clean. Lena admitted she had stopped asking why finished frames disappeared before sunrise. Rosa admitted she had accepted interior orders that changed without explanation. Thomas repeated that fear of losing 38 jobs had kept him quiet. None of those choices made them criminals. But Mason refused to turn innocence into perfection. "We missed the warning signs," he told the investigators. "That is not the same as knowing what Grant did, but it is something we have to live differently after this." The distinction held. By the end of the second week, the government removed the restoration employees from the conspiracy count. Seized personal tools were returned. The youngest apprentices received written confirmation that they were witnesses, not suspects. Some workers cried when the notices arrived. Others folded them carefully and placed them in toolboxes, as if paper could still be trusted only when kept near steel. Grant Locke remained in custody. Simon Crane agreed to identify shell buyers after learning Grant had blamed the financial operation entirely on him. His testimony led investigators to broker offices, staged auction companies, and private storage facilities in 3 states. The network had purchased flood wrecks and salvage vehicles for almost nothing, then circulated criminal money through controlled buyers who paid impossible prices. Some cars were sold repeatedly through different companies, each transaction making the money appear further removed from its source. The final arrests happened before the names of the cooperating workers became public. Months later, Grant was convicted of laundering, fraud, evidence fabrication, and obstruction, then sentenced to federal prison. The government seized the old workshop. A receiver offered Mason temporary control while the case moved forward. Several workers expected him to accept. Grant's office could have been his. Edwin's name was still carved above the main doors. Mason declined. "The building remembers what happened here," he told Lena. "That does not mean we have to stay inside it." They rented a smaller depot across town. It had cracked windows, uneven floors, and only 2 functioning lifts. The first winter rain found 3 leaks in the roof. No one complained. They repaired the roof together before opening day. The new shop was not Mason's. It belonged to a cooperative formed by the workers who chose to return. Every department held a vote. Every project arrived with a disclosed owner, a complete damage history, and a written explanation of where the vehicle would go after restoration. Any worker could stop a job and ask a question. No one could punish that question by threatening payroll. Mason proposed calling the shop Edwin Locke Restoration. Lena disagreed. "Edwin taught more than one person," she said, "and more than one person saved us." They called it the 112. Not all of the original workers joined. Some had lost too much trust in the trade. Others moved away or found jobs in factories where no customer demanded secrecy. Their names still appeared on the first wall inside the new depot. All 112. The first vehicle accepted by the cooperative was not rare. It belonged to a retired school custodian who had kept it beneath a torn cover for 26 years. Its engine was locked. Mice had destroyed the seats. Rain had entered through a broken rear window. He apologized twice for not being able to afford a perfect restoration. Mason told him perfection was not the service they sold. When the work ended, a metal plaque was fixed beneath the hood. It listed the original condition, every major part replaced, and the names of each person who had contributed. Lena Ortiz Structural Repair, Rosa Delgado Interior, Thomas Avery Body Finishing. 4 apprentices cleaning, wiring, and assembly. Mason Reed final safety inspection. No title was larger than another. On opening day, Rachel arrived carrying a small evidence bag. Inside was Edwin's silver badge. Investigators had recovered it from the oil tray after the raid. The face was scratched, and a black stain remained along one edge. Rachel asked whether Mason wanted the polishing wheel. He shook his head. They mounted the badge above the entrance exactly as it was. Months later, a new apprentice noticed the stain while closing the shop. "You could make that look new," he said. Mason looked across the floor. The custodian's car stood beneath the lights. Under its hood, every worker's name reflected faintly in the polished metal. "We restore what was damaged," Mason said. "We don't erase what happened to it." Then he switched off the lights, leaving the stained badge above the door.